Okay, so at the end of last class, I got started on my own article. I'll finish my discussion of that in another article by Brian Erb, and then we'll finish off with a chapter from Green's book that I think helps bring some different threads together. On the subject of my paper, I forgot to mention, you'll have to indulge me, one fun fact about this paper. I don't know if I'm allowed to admit this, but I don't plan on continuing in research, so. One of the peer reviewers was Joshua Green. I suspected it as I was reading them, and then emailed him afterwards, published, were you one of the reviewers? And he was, so one fun little fact about it. And speaking of Green, I doubt any of you noticed, but I added a reading to Unit 4, Sharif 2014. This is the same Azim Sharif from a prior unit. He actually co-authored this paper with Joshua Green. However, since I'm adding it late, it's not testable, so don't worry about it, but I just wanted to flag that before I forgot. Okay, so I'll start by reviewing the 4 measures that are extracted from my paper. It might be hard to keep track of all of them, so I'll start by reviewing that. The first 2 come from Conway's paper. So remember, there's dilemmas in which harm maximizes the greater good, and dilemmas in which harm does not maximize the greater good. And so the measure of utilitarianism, which in my paper I call the other sacrificial, or a measure of other sacrificial utilitarianism, sometimes just shortened to the OU parameter. And then there's the deontology parameter, or D parameter. So this one is how much do you endorse sacrificing other people, but only when it maximizes the greater good. So this minus this. Deontology is a measure of rejecting harm in both types of dilemmas. What my paper added was something similar for self-sacrificial dilemmas. So in some dilemmas, self-sacrifice maximizes the greater good. In some, 10 of each. Self-sacrifice does not maximize the greater good. It's the same idea. This minus this gives you a measure of, in this case, self-sacrificial utilitarianism, or SU. So that's this minus this. In other words, how likely are you to endorse self-sacrifice, but only when it maximizes the greater good? And then the altruism, or A parameter, is how much you tend to endorse self-sacrifice in both types of dilemmas. So I'll be running through some of the results, but just before I do that, because I'll be referring to these in passing, any questions about the 4 measures? So the first study, very simple one, got these 4 measures, and then, or I guess before, and one thing, for whatever it's worth, if you're using the cognitive reflection test, you tend to only get the result if you give the cognitive reflection test first, at least in moral psychology. Other studies have found that too. You can think of different reasons for it. So in our study, we give the cognitive reflection test first, then these various moral measures. And what you find is that the cognitive reflection test is positively correlated with both the OU and SU parameters, so both of the utilitarian measures. In that study, they were both a little over 0.2, so not especially large, but in the direction that Green would predict. Yes?
And then I think you left off last time saying that the OU and the SU with instruction, it increased?
Yeah, I'll say that next. So I'm just gonna, last class I gave just kind of a quick 2 sentences. I'll go in more detail now. But yes, and reminder too, the cognitive reflection test is questions like the ball and bat question, where there's an intuitive answer that pops into your head and a correct answer that requires reflection. Additionally, in this study, I gave the two subscales of Kahan's scale, the Oxford Utilitarianism scale. So Kahan and Green are often, thought of as enemies, but in this case there is nice convergence. So the impartial beneficence scale correlates with the self-sacrificial utilitarianism scale parameter, which makes sense, and the instrumental harm subscale correlates with the other sacrificial utilitarianism. So this could provide a basis for convergence between the two teams. But the important part for the dual process model is the fact that both utilitarian measures are positively correlated with cognitive reflection. So then to answer this person's question, in the next study, I did an experiment, because of course you all know correlation is not causation. Randomly assigned people to 2 conditions. In one condition, they are told, when you read these dilemmas, use reason, not emotion, when you're thinking through them. In the other, they are told to rely on emotion. So kind of go with your gut with these dilemmas. In study 2, there was an effect in the direction that Green would predict, namely that people in the reason condition had higher utilitarianism scores. However, it was not significant. P-value of around 0.1. So what I did was, in study 4, I replicated with a larger sample, because I presumed it was due to low power, and with a larger sample, the effects were both significant. That means the effects are not particularly large. You need a larger sample to detect them, but they are in the direction that Green would predict. One other thing I did in study 3 and then again in study 4 is added the public goods game. So remember, this is the one where there's a common pot. There's 4 people. They each have a choice of how much, in this case we use tokens, which are then used for a raffle for money. How many tokens you give to the common pot. Common pot is multiplied by 2 and then divided evenly. People were randomly assigned to either do this in a single game version, where they know they're only doing it once, and a multi-game version where they're going to do it 10 times. And here my prediction was, given that there was evidence that the utilitarian measures were positively correlated with reflection, I predicted that there would be a correlation between the utilitarian measures and giving, but only in the multi-game version. So in the multi-game version, it's more strategic to give, more kind of economically rational. So it would make sense if the utilitarian measures were correlated with giving. In fact, we found the opposite. The correlation between giving and utilitarianism was only positive in the single game condition. So this does not provide extra evidence for the dual process model. In cases like this, you can try to tell a story about it. The story we try to tell in the discussion section is that giving in the single game condition is more genuinely self-sacrificial, right? You're giving to help the group overall. So you could think of it as kind of evidence of the validity of these 2 measures of utilitarianism. That's a little bit ad hoc. You could think of different explanations, but in any case, the result is that giving in the public goods game only has a positive correlation with the utilitarian measures when it's the single game condition. And then we replicated that with a larger sample in study 4. So study 4 is kind of the cleanup study where we replicated everything with a bigger sample. So that's the core of what we found. Yes?
How strong was your positive correlation with these single games?
Let me refresh my memory. In study 4 with the bigger sample, 0.13 for both around. So yeah, not very large. In social psychology, you often find correlations like that, but it was statistically significant. Any other questions about this reading? So there was another study I did that I did not include in the article, but I did include in the dissertation. But to understand that study, study 5, I have to talk about Brian Earp's paper. This is, I think, one of the best readings in this course. For one thing, it was published in Nature. I don't know if you know Nature, but that's like the best scientific journal in the world. So if you get it published there, you're a big deal. I think I've mentioned in passing that Brian Earp's Google Scholar page depresses me immensely, just to give you a sense of that.
Wasn't it passing?
Not that I'm really as concerned with doing research. I always thought aimed at teaching, but here, actually, how's that even possible? He already has publications in 2025. Okay. He's also a time traveler. So let's just go through 2024. So all of these are 2024. And we haven't finished yet. There's 2023. So, yeah. So no matter how productive you are, there's always someone higher up. I don't know how the man sleeps, but somehow he manages to pull it off. So what did Earp look at? So he starts off by taking a little bit of a passing shot at people who research sacrificial type dilemmas and says that, look, there may be some insight you can get from looking at this, but these dilemmas are very unlike the dilemmas we face in ordinary life. For one thing, they typically involve strangers, right? The guy with the large backpack or the large man on the footbridge is not said to be someone you know. Most of our moral dilemmas involve relationships with other people. So, using different measures motivated by prior theoretical work, Earp conceptualizes relationships as having 4 different cooperative functions. And relationships can serve these to a greater or lesser degree. The first is care. So care, the goal in a care relationship is to secure the welfare of another person, so to benefit them. And in many of the standard cases, it's thought to be kind of unconditional. So, like take a mother and child, right? The mother is not trying to get something in return. Doesn't get mad at the baby if it doesn't reciprocate, right? It's just, the mother's just aiming at, benefiting the child. If you do expect something in return, then the relationship serves the function of reciprocity. So think of the work on reciprocal altruism, right? This is where, I do something nice for you today, you do something nice for me tomorrow. We can maintain a long-term cooperative alliance through mutually benefiting each other. So like friendships, right? Friendships would fall into this bucket, or in this bucket. The next is hierarchy. So in some relationships, there is a difference in status. So obedience is owed to one of the parties in the relationship. So there's work, this is something that exists in other mammals, right? Other mammals have like dominance hierarchies. You see this reflected to some extent in humans. So in relationships where there's a difference in status or power, then it's a hierarchical relationship. And then the last one, which requires no further explanation, is mating. So sexual, romantic type relationships. So the first thing that Earp did was just with a sample, ask people to what extent different relationships should serve these 4 functions. He asked people, how much should co-worker relationships serve these 4 different functions? He has very beautiful, multicolored graphic representation of the results, which most of the papers in psych don't have. So here's what he found. So you can look at any relationship the more the distribution is towards the green, the more likely people are to say, yes, it should serve this function. So, mother-child, virtually everyone says it should serve the care function, for example. Strangers, there's kind of a range. Some people say not at all, some people say to some extent, but people generally don't say that it should serve care as much as, mother-child relationships, for example. You do not have to memorize the pattern, but very nice set of findings. I will note one depressing finding, at least for a member of Team Male. They report a sex difference on two of them. Women were more likely to say that various relationships should serve the care function. Males were not. They were more likely to say that various relationships can or should serve the mating function. So that's too bad.
Is that depressing, or is it just?
I mean, it just is what it is.
It's just it was expected, really.
Perhaps expected, but some expected things are depressing. So I won't test you on that, of course. So then to provide, before that, he also did a cluster analysis. So looked at the types of relationships that tend to hang together in terms of the pattern of endorsing different functions. So the two green ones are ones that people tend to say they should serve the mating function. That one's really unsurprising. The gray ones are more oriented towards hierarchy. Pink ones are more oriented towards care. And the blue ones are more oriented towards reciprocity. And then lastly, they came up with a list of different sorts of actions that would weaken the different functions. So, not providing food to someone when they need it. So for the care function, that's going to be, said to weaken it, or if you don't provide food. In the context of, say, a mother-child relationship, that's going to be judged to be very wrong if you don't do that. But if it's a non-paying customer, which is more about reciprocity, not going to be judged to be as wrong. So the extent to which an action is judged to be wrong depends on the type of relationship it is and how much that relationship is thought to serve this particular relational function. So to say a little more about that, I have Earp himself talking about this study. So that was published right within the last few years. Very good work. Very sophisticated, so if that interests you, that could be a promising paper topic, right at the cutting edge, as I say. So this connects back to, let's say one or two more things about my own work, because I was really impressed with this paper and thought I'd try to integrate it at least a little bit. So what I did was created 5 versions of the self-sacrificial dilemmas, one for each of the 4 main clusters of relationships. So remember that in that video he talks about how there are 4 kind of clusters of relationships in terms of which cooperative function they load most heavily on. So I took one from each, created a version of the self-sacrificial dilemma that involved self-sacrifice on behalf of people in one of these relationships. I wanted to see what would happen there. So for starters, I'll do a little poll. I'm curious how you all would respond. So here are the 5 I chose. So for a care-oriented relationship, I chose sibling. That was one that loaded heavily on it. For a mating-type relationship, I chose significant other. You can write these down. I'll ask you to rank them. Some will be pretty obvious. For a cooperative one, I chose friend. For hierarchical one, I chose subordinate at work. And I also added stranger as a 5th one. Now technically the stranger relationship loads heavily on the reciprocity function, but I thought I'd list it as a separate type of relationship. So 2 of these should be pretty obvious, but I want you to rank those from 1 to 5. 5 meaning you would be most likely to self-sacrifice on behalf of that person. Maybe not necessarily death, although it could be death, but give up on your own interests to benefit them. And then 1 being you'd be the least likely to self-sacrifice on behalf of a person who is in that relationship to you.
Sibling,
So it's sibling, significant other, friend, subordinate at work, and stranger. Okay, is anyone still working on it? Okay, so show of hands, did anyone put, which one was number 5 is the question. I'm going to assume no one put subordinate or stranger. Is anyone the odd one out? Okay. Did anyone say friend? Did anyone say significant other? Maybe a third. Who said sibling? Good, so that same result I found in my studies. So when you give these self-sacrificial dilemmas I wrote, but then have people assigned to different conditions, they give the highest endorsement of self-sacrifice in the when it's the sibling relationship. Here's the chart. So this is mean self-sacrifice in the dilemmas where both utilitarians and altruists should endorse self-sacrifice, and you see it's highest for sibling and very unsurprisingly lowest for stranger. So then what I did was use relationship type as a variable. Yes?
Did your sample all have siblings?
It's a good question. I wonder what, because you're told to imagine, that I think there may have been if you don't have someone in this relationship, imagine you do. I think that may have been included, because also some people may not have romantic partners, or, well, I shouldn't say not have friends, but anyway, so what I did is I turned a relationship type into a variable, ranked from 1 to 5, so the order in which people tend to endorse self-sacrifice, and looked at the extent to which it was correlated with the SU parameter and the A parameter. And the punchline there is, relationship type correlates more strongly with the altruism parameter, at about 0.5, whereas it correlates with the self-sacrificial utilitarian parameter only at around 0.2. So utilitarian judgment is less driven by relational context and therefore more impartial. At least that's the spin we put on it. Yes?
Oh, sorry, I got zoned out and I forgot. Oh, right.
Yep.
What if you primed it so that it was, say, a sibling that you were no longer in touch with, or
well, of course,
subordinate that you didn't particularly like? Would the strangers be higher then because you're
it could be, but I mean presumably
that
that affects all of them, right? I guess other than stranger, the relationship could be one that's strained. I was kind of wondering if someone put sibling lower than stranger. You never know. So we have a bad relationship with them, but presumably that kind of washes out, right, in a big sample.
Yeah, I would just think that if you say subordinate at work, the first person I think of is somebody that I get along with, right? But
well, maybe
personally,
you do, yeah.
I'm just wondering if that's a common thing, or if it's just
Yeah, I mean, empirical question. You could write your paper on it. That's my default when I have nothing else to say. Yeah, you could write your paper on it. There's one other thing I have listed in the key terms for my dissertation, but I'll just skip over that, and I'll see if we can get through what I have to say about the last reading. Actually, I guess we probably won't have time to do all of it, but I'll at least get started on it. Actually, here's what I'll do. Since I'm not going to finish everything today, I'll be nice again and give the written questions early. There's your trade-off. So we will have to eat in a bit to the beginning of the test review day to finish the last green reading. but my gift will be, you'll know what the written questions are now. Am I not merciful? Okay, so the first written, you will have to provide 2 lines of evidence for a connection between manual mode or cognitive reflection or system 2, and however you want to frame it, and consequentialist or utilitarian judgment. The next one will be about the Boston paper and the Plunkett paper written in response. So familiarize yourself with those 2. And the last one will be about the Kahan 2015 paper, not the 2018 one, the 2015 one, and the Conway 2018 paper that's written in response. Okay, does that make sense? Any questions on those 3? Yep. First one is 2 lines of evidence for a connection between cognitive reflection and utilitarian judgment. So you can use the, so there you could use my paper. Again, my paper will not be on any of the definition questions, but that's one option. There's lots of relevant studies in the Green 2015 paper, so that one gives you choices. Okay, as I say, we'll get started on the last reading, which is the chapter from Green's book, Moral Tribes. So one idea he summarizes here, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, you've probably heard of, you've taken an economics class. How many of you know the tragedy of the commons thought experiment? A handful. So it's just a thought experiment, although actually it is based on some real data, but it's used as a kind of metaphor for the conflict between what is individually rational and what's rational for the group to do. Some of the economic games we've talked about have a similar kind of structure, but this is a very vivid example. So you're supposed to imagine there's a bunch of sheep herders, and they have kind of their own pastures with their sheep, but they also have a common pasture. So this looks a bit like the public goods game, which, as I say, has a similar structure. The public goods game, or some public common pastures, any of the farmers or sheep herders can use. So if they're running a little low this week, they can put some of their sheep here, and they can eat some of the grass there. So if everyone just puts a few sheep in here every once in a while, then it benefits everyone. They have this common pasture they can take advantage of when they need to, but so long as they don't put too many in there, the pasture won't run out of grass. But let's say we're this guy right here. From an individual, kind of selfish, rational point of view, it's better for me if I put in a little extra, right? Not so many that by myself I will eat all the grass, but just enough to benefit me a little extra. But if everyone does that, if everyone thinks, yeah, I should put in a few more than we agreed to so that I can reap the benefits, then the common pasture will dry up and all the grass will be gone. So again, the conflict here is what is sort of beneficial for me as a selfish individual. If everyone chooses to do that, we are all worse off for it. Lots of cooperative, potentially cooperative situations have this kind of structure. Think of like group projects, right? If you slack off a bit and hope that others do the work, that's really good for you. But if everyone does that, you're all fucked, right? So that's what happens here. So what Green says is, our moral intuitions that we have from evolution and culture are designed to solve this problem, or this kind of problem. This is a me versus us kind of problem. So the kinds of intuitions we talked about that we get from reciprocal altruism, as well as the intuitions that are kind of shaped by cultural norms that evolve over time, those are, according to Green, designed to make sure we don't fall into this trap. So that's what morality is for, at least our everyday common sense kind of morality. But in the modern world, we have what Green calls a different kind of tragedy. He calls it the tragedy of common sense morality. The trouble is that different cultures have different solutions to these kinds of cooperative dilemmas, different norms, different moral systems. But we live in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world, and this leads to collisions. It leads to disagreements, debate. And in fact, not even between cultures, even within cultures. Like, let's say our neighbors to the south, right? There are competing sets of values for what's right and wrong, and this leads to disagreement. It's going to be a long night tomorrow. That's why I was hoping to be done today, so I didn't have to think about teaching, but I can tell I'll have something left over for Wednesday. So the tragedy of common sense morality is the problem of us versus them. So what Green says is the moral solutions that worked for this, for helping us cooperate with people and not cheat each other, may not work for conflicts between groups because we've arrived at different sorts of values and different sorts of solutions. So Green says, what we need is a common currency. Common currency meaning a specific value or maybe a set of values that we can all agree on to adjudicate our moral disagreements. So for the sorts of dilemmas that moral tribes disagree about, look, we can believe whatever we want when we are on our own pastures, but when we're in a globally interconnected world, we have to find something to adjudicate our disagreements. So we saw earlier that Green gave an empirically based argument for utilitarianism. Here he gives more of a conceptual one. And basically what he says is, look, there are two things we can all agree on when we are trying to solve the tragedy of common sense morality. The first thing we can agree on, or what we have to agree on in order to solve it, is who matters. And what he says is, in order to solve the tragedy of common sense morality, we have to say everyone matters. We can't just say, my group should win and every other group should lose. That's not going to lead to consensus about which values to rely on. So we have to say everyone matters equally. In answer to the question, what matters, and here I think is maybe the weakest link in the argument, but it has some initial plausibility. Green says that we should think that what matters is our experience, right? Happiness and suffering. And the reason is, he conjectures that's the one thing we can all agree on. We may have all sorts of competing values and competing moral judgments, but we at least all like being happy and don't like suffering. So it's a promising kind of common currency, right? We may have our own moral views when we're dealing with members of our group, but when adjudicating disagreement, we should appeal to happiness and suffering because it's something that we all value. It may not be the only thing we value, but it may be the only thing that each group or each team values. Okay, so that leaves just two terms, but those take longer to explain. Any questions before we go? All right, we'll stop there. See you all on Wednesday.